Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Nun Gimel. Amar le Rabbi Zera le Abaye. Shahara niskalin delaketi behu sekila. Degamri me'ovi de'oni. B'mai gamri. B'mot yumetu gamri. Or b'dmehem bam gamre. Rabbi Zera asked Abaye regarding the various people who deserve the capital punishment of stoning. We're going to see a list in the very next Mishnah coming up soon. There's a list of all the crimes and sins that deserve capital punishment by stoning. Now, for some of these, it says explicitly that they get stoned, like Mechalel Shabbat, like an idolater, a single person who goes to idolatry, like an Na'ara Me'orasa who commits adultery, and like Oven Yideoni. Right? So those, it says explicitly that they get stoned. But for most of the others on the list, it does not say explicitly what the punishment is. So we have to derive what it is. We saw yesterday that there was a general rule that if it's unspecified, then we go to the lowest one, which is chenek, unless there is some hint or some derivation. So that's the question that Rabbi Zera is asking Abaye. All the other people who deserve capital punishment of sikila, but it doesn't say explicitly that it is sikila, so we're going to learn it. He knows that we're going to learn it from Oven Yideoni, but the question is, Bayigezera Shava, from which words in Oven Yideoni? Here's the pasuk of Oven Yideoni. Ish or Isha, Kiye Behem Ov or Yideoni. This is different kind of sorcerers. Mot Yumatu, Ba'even Yidgimu Otam Demehem Bam. So for here it says explicitly that they will pelt him with stones. Now it also says Mot Yumatu. So is that the key word? So since it says Mot Yumatu here, and it does in fact say Mot Yumatu in those other places, so is this the key word that we're going to use for a Gezerah Shava, or Demehem Bam, their blood is upon them? Maybe that's the key word that we're going to use for Gezerah Shava, which also appears in the other contexts. So that's his question. He knows we're learning from Oven Yideoni. Here it's explicit, and few of the places it's explicit, so that's not a problem. For those that it's not explicit, how are we making a Gezerah Shava? From this word or from this word? That's the question. From Mot Yumetu or from Demehem Bam Gamre? Rabbi answers, Amar le Demehem Bam Gamre. We're learning from Demehem Bam, which it says here and there. De'ibe Mot Yumetu Gamre Demehem Lamali. Because if you're going to learn it from Mot Yumetu, then why do we need the doubling of Demehem here and Demehem there? So then what would we need that for? Okay, well that's not really a full answer, because we ask Elamai b'demehem gamre mot yumetu lamali. If you say the other way around, that we use the Gezerah Shava from Ovid Yideoni from the word demehem, then you could ask, why do we need mot yumetu? So no matter which one you choose, you can ask about then why is there a parallel word for the other word that appears in both places. So for that half, we have an answer. Kedetanya, mot yumat hamaker oseyachu, en li ela b'mita ketubah bo. מניין שמי אתה יכול להמיתו במיטה שכתובה בו, שאתה ממיתו בכל מיטה שאתה יכול להמיתו. תלמוד אומר מות יומת המכה מכל מקום. There is a braita that tells us what we use mot yumat for. When it says that the murderer shall be put to death, mot yumat hamakeh, because he's a rotzeach. So I know from that a murderer gets capital punishment. Fine. Now, how do I know that? Let's say I can't kill a person. A murderer usually gets decapitation. Let's say I can't do it. Let's say that I'm supposed to give this. We found a murderer, we convicted him, and now he runs away on a boat, and he's a fugitive. So we can't bring him and do the decapitation as we described before with the sword. Because he's running away. But maybe we can sink the boat, and then he'll drown, and that would be like strangulation. So can we kill him that way, because we can't do it the preferred way? So the answer is yes, because of the double language, mot yumat hamakeh mikol makom. You should kill him in the normal, in the way that's prescribed for that crime. But if you can't, then you can give him a different one. Well, he's supposed to get, so you don't have a sword. Okay, but you have a handkerchief. All right, so then you can do a different, you can do strangulation. So that's what we learned from Mot Yumat. So in fact, we need Mot Yumat for that teaching, and Demehem, however, is extra. So therefore, he says the Gezerah Shava is going to be from the extra words Demehem. That's Abaye's answer to Rabbi Zerah. Okay, end of that conversation. But now we have two later rabbis with a follow-up conversation. Amar le Rav Acha medifti l'Ravina v'i b'mot yumetu gamre ma'ika kashya le Rav Acha medifti es Ravina. And if they had learned from mot yumetu, what would be Zerah's problem? In other words, it looks like Rabbi Zerah is asking this not out of the blue, but he wanted to make sure that we're learning it from Demehem, because if the answer would have been that we learned it from mot yumetu, then he would have had a problem with that. And so he's like, oh, okay, good. I'm glad you said we learned it from Demehem. He accepted that answer, but the other way would have been a problem. So what would have been the problem if we learn the Gezerah Shava from Mot Yumetu? Ilema eshet ish kakashele lemete ulemigmar Mot Yumat me'ovi de'oni malalan beskila afkan beskila. So here's a potential problem of eshet ish, because it says regarding eshet ish Mot Yumetu, and it also says regarding ovenya de'oni Mot Yumat. And so then I would have said just like Mot Yumat regarding ovenya de'oni means sekila, so Gezerah Shava to adultery, that would also be sikila, but that's not true. Adultery for a married woman is only chenek, and so we would come to the wrong conclusion, and so that would be the potential difficulty that we avoid. It doesn't say demehem regarding eshet ish. So if you learn it from Mot Yumat, then we would come to a wrong conclusion that it is that adultery would be sikila, but it's not. So is that what he was avoiding? And the answer is no. No, I would know that adultery of a married woman can't be sikila, because the Torah goes out of its way to say that na'ara me'orasa, oh, she commits adultery, that's different. She gets sikila. That means that she is different, and that from the regular woman, a married woman who commits adultery. So since it says that's an exception, and obviously a married woman is not sikila. So I would know that a married woman is not sikila, and even if we learned in general from Mot Yumat, I wouldn't make a mistake regarding eshet ish, because since it says na'ara me'orasa sikila, I would know a married woman is not sikila, so then I would go back to chenek. So that's not the problem. So what would be the problem if we learned the Gezerah Shava from Mot Yumat? Ve'ela makia bi ve'imo. Well, it says regarding someone who hits his father and mother, Mot Yumat. And if I use that phrase for the Gezerah Shava, I would make a Gezerah Shava for ovenya de'oni, and just like ovenya de'oni is sikila, I would say someone who hits his father and mother is also sikila. Even though that's not true, that would come to a wrong conclusion. Oh, ad gamre me'oved de'oni ligmeru me'eshet ish di'atarasha l'moshcha lachmir aleha ela lehakel aleha. But now we answer, no, we wouldn't have made that mistake either, because since it says Mot Yumat regarding someone hits his father and mother. It also says Mot Yumat regarding Oven Yedoni. If I did that, I would learn Sekila. But it also says Mot Yumat regarding Eshet Ish. And so if I could learn the same phrase there, and I know that's Chenek, and then I would learn that this is Chenek. Now, since the Gezerah Shava is ambiguous, when you have an ambiguous Gezerah Shava, then you have to assume the more lenient position. We can't kill someone just based on, well, I feel like it. We can only assume the least severe form of capital punishment. And so, therefore, I would have no trouble. Rabbi Zerah would not have any trouble regarding this case either. So we're back to the question: when Rabbi Zerah was asking, which one do we make a Gezerah Shava? Which phrase do we use? And it implied that Demehem, okay, that good. He liked that answer. But if it was Mot Yumat, he would have a problem. Well, this wouldn't be a problem either. So, because it would be clear that we would choose the least severe among the two options for a Gezerah Shava. So, last answer: Amar le shara niskalin gufai hu kakashele di be'mot Yumat gamre ad gamre me'ovi de'oni ligmeru me'eshet ish. And the answer is we would have a problem for all the other things on the list that we're about to read. Because if you're going to make a Gezerah Shava from Mot Yumat, and he says there's mochumat and ovenia deoni, and therefore all these other cases where it doesn't say sikila, that also means sikila. If you do that, well then, you by the same logic, you can make a gezerah shava of mochumat to eshet ish, and there we know it's chenek, and then you learn that everywhere it says mochumat is chenek, and then you'd be missing out a derivation for a bunch of items on this list, and that wouldn't work at all. That's why the Bezerah was asking, are you going to learn from mochumat? Then what are you going to do with that? If, in other words, if the answer would have been, we learned from mochumat, the Bezerah would have followed up with, wait a second, then why are you comparing everything to oviniya deoni? That is sikila. Compare everything to eshet ish, and then it would be chenek, and then that we'd be stuck. But thankfully, the answer was, we learned it from demehem. Demehem, that it doesn't say in eshet ish. That is a clearer source from which to make a gezerah shava. Anytime it says demehem bam, like it does in oviniya deoni, therefore that is also sikila. Okay, good. Now we come to the next Mishnah of the list. So far in the Mishnayot, we've described the procedure for all the forms of capital punishment. Now that we've described the procedure, now we're going to go in the next few Mishnayot and chapters. We're going to go through all the people that deserve each type of capital punishment. Elu hen haniskalin haba al ha'em v'al eshet ha'av, someone who has relations with his mother, incest, or with his father's wife. Now, usually a father's wife is also a mother. The Gemara is going to discuss in detail today if it's both his father's mother, his father's wife and his mother, then what happens? Are you liable to 2 counts or not? But right now we can assume we're talking about a mother who is not necessarily married to the father, so it doesn't have to be, or it could be a father's wife who's not his mother. It's a stepmother that she got married to afterwards. But either way, that's sikila. Kala, a daughter-in-law. Zachur, a male. Behema, a bestiality. This is talking about a man who commits bestiality with an animal, or isha, hamibi'at behema, or a woman who commits bestiality with an animal. Megadev, a blasphemer. Habed avodah zara, idolater. Hanoten mizar olamolech, someone who passes his children through fire as worship for Molech. Baal ovi deoni, these necromancers, sorcerers, people who call up the dead and divine things in all kinds of prohibited ways. Mechelet Shabbat violator. Mekalel abi ve'imo, someone who curses his father or his mother. Habal na'ara ma'orasa, someone who commits adultery with a na'ara ma'orasa. Hamesit v'hamediach, someone who incites an individual to follow idolatry. That's mesit. Mediach is someone who incites a whole city to follow avodah zarah. Mechashef, a magician or warlock. Ben sored umoreh, rebellious son. So all these get sikila. Now, haba al ha'em chayav aleha mishum em umishum eshet av. Now back to the first two that we already started discussing. If someone has relations with his mother, who is also married to his father, I mean, in a normal case of parents, so that person is liable to 2 counts. Number 1, because it's his mother, and number 2, because it's his father's wife. Now, I know you're going to ask, how can you kill someone twice? What, are you going to throw him off the roof again? He's already dead. You can only kill someone once. That's true. But this will make a difference in the case of shogeg. Let's say someone has relations with this woman, not knowing who she was. He thought it was someone else. It was dark, he was drunk, whatever. And turns out it was his mother and his father's wife. So you don't get capital punishment for shogeg. Instead, he has to bring korban hatat. In this case, we would have to bring 2 korban hatats. That's according to Tanakama. Even though it's only 1 act, but it's 1 act that violates 2 prohibitions, so that will be 2 korbans. Rabbi Yehuda omer eno chayav ela mishum ha'em belbahad. Rabbi Yehuda says no, only 1 is liable because of mother, and once you violate that one, that is the only one, and he's not liable for father's wife. If it was a stepmother, then father's wife would kick in, and there would be he would get the punishment for that. But if it happens to be his mother, then father's wife does not apply, according to the Yehuda. Habal eshet av chayav mishum eshet av umishum eshet ish. Now, if someone sleeps with his father's wife, and while they're married, his father and that wife is married. Let's assume it's not his mother. So his stepmother, while his father is married to her, that is liable to 2 counts. 1, it's his father's wife, and 2, adultery, because they're married at the time. So ben bechayavi, ben achar mitatavi, ben mina erusin, ben min mina nisuin. And this is true whether the father is alive or the father is dead. Now, actually, if the father is dead, then he's only liable to one. It's not called eshet ish when a man dies. When a man dies, they're not married anymore. But the prohibition of stepmother applies even after the father is dead. In other words, once a father is married to a woman, even if they're divorced or he dies, she is prohibited to that man's sons forever, even after they're not married anymore. So this clause itself really actually only applies to stepfather if the father is dead, stepmother if the father is dead. And this clause applies to both, whether they only had erusin or nisuin. If a person is with his stepmother and while erusin with his father, also liable to 2 counts, stepmother and also adultery. Habal kalato chayav aleh mishum kalato mishum eshet ish. If someone has relations with his daughter-in-law while she's married to his son, that's also 2 counts. Number 1, incest of daughter-in-law, and second, since she's a married woman, that's also idolatry. Ben b'cheya beno ben nachal mitat beno ben min erusin ben min nisuin. And here the same thing. If the son is alive, then it's 2 counts. If the son is dead, well, they're not married anymore. So then the adultery would drop out, but it's still his daughter-in-law, right? After his son dies or gets divorced, the father can never be with his former daughter-in-law. And it also does not matter whether they only had erusin or nisuin. Adultery is adultery, both from erusin or nisuin. The punishment is different, but the punishment, but the adultery is the same. So not in all these cases actually would it be sekila from nisuin. Adultery from nisuin is actually not sekila. So that's not the point. That was not on this list. The point of this is everything on this list. Nadam or asa sekila. If it's married, then it will be chenek. But the point of these machlokot is, can you have 2 violations in one? And so we saw that in the first case, it is in fact a machloket between Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yehuda. But in this case, there is no machloket. And yes, one can be liable on 2 counts, which wouldn't make a difference if it's capital punishment. Although if it's different capital punishments, you'd get the more severe one. So that would make some difference, but it would make certainly a difference if it was shogeg, and then you have to bring 2 korbans. Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda omer, im lo hayta imo reuya le'aviv, eno chayav ela mishum ha'em bilvad. A braita that elaborates on Rabbi Yehuda's opinion in the Mishnah, says this is talking about someone who has relations with his mother, and that's also his father's wife. And so Tanna Kama said 2 counts. Rabbi Yehuda said, no, only 1 count. And here, now, this version of Rabbi Yehuda adds, if his mother was not fit for his father, in other words, if their relation is prohibited, if he's not allowed to marry her, then he's only liable to relations with his mother. In other words, according to this, Rabbi Yehuda agrees that if this guy's father and mother have a totally kosher marriage, right, they're allowed to marry each other, there's nothing wrong with their marriage, and then he has relations with his mother, Rabbi Yehuda would agree that he's liable to 2 counts, 1 incest with his mother and 1 incest with his father's wife. However, if their marriage is prohibited, we're going to see what kind of prohibition it is, right? That there's something that Kohen or Mamzer, we'll see what the prohibition is, or they're related themselves. Then the father's wife prohibition doesn't apply because there's something wrong with the marriage. They can't even get married. Maybe they're not even married. And so that count falls away, but it still is his mother, so then there's only 1. Okay, so according to this, but Rabbi Yehuda is only disagreeing in the case where the parents have a problematic marriage. Now, now how problematic are we talking about? What is the problem? If you're talking about something, the marriage is chayav karet, or bet din would kill the person for such a thing, like if it's incest or something like that. Then in that case, Rabbanan, who the Tanna Kama disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, you're saying in that case, the Tanna Kama would say there is 2 counts, even though this marriage is no good. There's no kiddushin. If someone tries to do kiddushin with his own sister, you could have a $1 million wedding and give a big ring, but they're never going to be married. There is no marriage. And so there is no prohibition of the son violating father's wife, because it's not his father's wife. It could be his mother, but certainly not going to be his father's wife if they are totally not allowed to be married to each other. So there would be no disagreement in that case between Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda. Ela chayave lavin. Rather, must be a marriage that for which one is chayav as a lav, like someone marries a mamzer. A kosher person marries a mamzer. That you're not allowed to do as a lav, but if you do a marriage ceremony, or you're not allowed to do it, but let's say you do a marriage ceremony, does it catch or not? Are they married or not? That's subject to a machloket. Rabbi Yehuda sabar like Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda sabar like Rabbi Akiva. Tamar en kiddushin tofsin b'chayabe lavin. Rabbi Yehuda agrees with Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva in general, we saw this in Masechet Yevamot, thinks that kiddushin does not take hold with chayabe lavin. If someone tries to marry a kosher person, marries a mamzer, they're not married, right? Even if he gives her a ring and everything, there's no marriage. You don't even need a get because it's chayav lavin. And that makes sense. That's why the Rabbi Yehuda, who follows Rabbi Akiva, says, if one of the parents is a mamzer, and then the marriage is not a marriage at all, and that if that son, if it is his mother, and it could be that they tried to get married and they had this child. So this is his father, this is his mother. But according to Rabbi Akiva, they were never married because she's a mamzer or he's a mamzer. And therefore, since it's not his father's wife, because they're not married, he doesn't violate father's wife prohibition. He does violate mother, because it still is his biological mother. And so that's the case of Rabbi Akiva. Whereas Rabbanan disagree with Rabbi Akiva. The Rabbanan, Tanakama says, if someone marries a mamzer, the marriage is valid. They're not allowed to get married. They're not allowed to be married, but they are married if they do it. And since they are married, if this child has relations with his mother, that's number one, his mother, and it is his father's wife. And so that's what the case that we're talking about, that where the Rabbi Yehuda says, if it's not a fitting marriage. Okay, good. So now that we understand that this makes sense, as long as you assume that Rabbi Yehuda follows the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Now we have a challenge to that. Mativ Rav Oshaya. Isur mitzvah v'isur kedusha chosot velo mitya be'emot. Rav Oshaya quotes a Mishnah in Yevamot that says, if you have a prohibition of a mitzvah, we'll define what this is in a second, or a prohibition because of kedusha, and you have a yavam and a yavama. So a man dies without children. His brother now is in a position to do yibum or chalitza with his sister-in-law. Now, if that relation is prohibited, like let's say it would be his own daughter. If someone married his niece and he died without children, and now the yavam is the father of the yavama. Could have such a case. In that case, you certainly cannot do yibum. That's for sure. That would be incest. And you don't even do chalitza in that case because there's no possibility to do yibum, and the whole thing is prohibited. So you don't even do chalitza. You can just go ahead and get married. So that would be a case where there was a very serious prohibition between the yavam and the yavama. But what if it's a less serious prohibition? Then, since it's possible to get married, there is a possibility of performing, of finalizing a marriage between them, but it's prohibited. So in these cases, they can't do yibum, but they must do chalitza, because since they could father and daughter, they can't get married no matter what. There's no such thing as a marriage. It wouldn't take hold. But in cases where it would take hold, then you have to do chalitza and not yibum. Now we'll explain what these categories are. Mishnah says, Isur mitzvah sheniot midivrei sofrim. Isur mitzvah is secondary incest. The Torah gives a list of things that are doraita incest, and this is secondary, one step removed, that on the doraita level, it's okay. The Rabbanan say an extra step. So these, if someone does try to do a marriage with one of these secondary relationships, the marriage is a marriage midoraita. But the rabbis disallow it. So therefore, you can't do yibum because the rabbis disallow it, but you have to do chalitza because deoraita, there is an obligation to do chalitza. V'may karule isur mitzvah, mitzvah dor lishmod divrei chachamim. It's called prohibitions of a mitzvah because there's a mitzvah to listen to what the rabbis say, and they said that these secondary incest relations are prohibited. Isur kedusha, amana lekohen gadol, kedusha v'chalutza lekohen hejot. Prohibitions regarding kedusha is a kohen gadol marrying an almana, or a regular kohen marrying a gedusha or a chalutza. V'amay karulehu isur kedusha, tichtib kedoshim yu lelohehem. Why is it called prohibitions of kedusha? Because it says that the kohanim have to be holy. And since they have to be holy, they're not allowed to form these relationships. Now, if a kohen would marry a gerusha, let's say he does, he gives her a ring and everything, that marriage does take effect. It's prohibited, but they are in fact married. Because they are in fact married, therefore, if such a situation would happen, that the yavam is a kohen, and the yavama was a divorcee from a previous marriage, so therefore it's a sur kedusha. They have to do chalitza and not yibum. They do have to do chalitza because they could be married, even though it's prohibited. So they have to do yibum because it's prohibited, but they have to do chalitza because a marriage will take hold. Okay, all that was what the Mishnah said. Betanya ala Rabbi Yehuda machalif. There's a braita that says Rabbi Yehuda switches the definitions of these categories. What you called isur kedusha, he thinks that's isur mitzvah. Isur mitzvah is isur kedusha. Okay, that doesn't make such a big difference for us. Here's the question. Chelufehu de machalif ha chalitza baya. Okay, switching the definition of the categories, but he agrees with the ruling that you need to do chalitza in these cases, in all these cases, including a kohen to a gerusha. Now, a kohen to a gerusha is a lav, and according to the majority of rabbis, kohen to a gerusha, since it's only a lav, if they do a marriage, the marriage will take hold. But according to Rabbi Akiva, a lav will not take hold. V'isa kadatech Rabbi Yehuda ke Rabbi Akiva svira le, michti chayve lavin Rabbi Akiva ke chayve kedetot ameh v'chayve. And if you think that, as we just did before, that Rabbi Yehuda follows Rabbi Akiva, and in that case, Rabbi Akiva says that a marriage that's prohibited by a lav, according to Rabbi Akiva, is like a marriage prohibited by karet. And a marriage prohibited by karet, since the marriage doesn't take hold, you don't have to do chalitza or yibum. There's nothing. So really, if Rabbi Yehuda followed Rabbi Akiva, then he would say that in a case of a kohen to a gerusha, and other cases too, since that's a lav, so the marriage doesn't take hold at all, and therefore, if it happens to be that the kohen, the yavam is a kohen, and the yavama is a gerusha, then you wouldn't have to do chalitza, you would do nothing at all, not yibum and not chalitza. Yet, Rabbi Yehuda agrees with the ruling over here that you have to do chalitza. So it doesn't make sense to say that Rabbi Yehuda follows Rabbi Akiva. And the answer is, lidvarav de Tanakh Kama ka'amar vele la sevira le. When Rabbi Yehuda said we should switch the order, he was saying, and for the opinion of Tanakh Kama, even if you would agree with Tanakh Kama that a surah lav, the marriage does take hold, and therefore you have to do chalitza in all these cases. For that opinion, you have to switch around the definitions. You just got the isur kedusha, isur mitzvah the wrong way around. But Rabbi Yehuda himself doesn't even agree at all with the ruling of this baraita, because he thinks that if it's a lav, like kohen to a gerusha, then you would not have to do, you wouldn't do yibum, and you wouldn't even have to do chalitza. Ki ata Rabbi Yitzchak taneh ki ditnan, Rabbi Yehuda omer eno chayav ela mishum ha'em bilbad. When Rabbi Yitzchak came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he quoted a braita that's the same as our Mishnah, that says, according to Rabbi Yehuda, one who has relations with his mother, who is married to his father, so he is liable not to 2 counts, but Tanakh Kama said 2 counts for his mother and his father's wife, but Rabbi Yehuda said no, only one, just for the mother. mother. If it happens to be his mother, then the father's wife does not apply. Father's wife only applies to a stepmother. Now, what's the source? What's the reason for the Yehuda? Amad Abaye. Damar kira mechahi mishum immo ata mechayevo v'ata mechayevo mishum eshet av. He says this from this extra pasuk here that says Ervat abicha ve'ervat imecha lo tegale. One cannot reveal nakedness of his father. We'll see what that means. It'll come up in a minute. And of his mother. So that's a reference to incest with the mother. Lo tegale. Then it says imechahi. Okay, I know you just told me that's his mother. So why do you have to say it's his mother? I mean, it sounds in Peshat just like a rhetorical. It's your mother. What are you doing? But for legally, it's an extra word. So what is it coming to teach us? So he says, imechahi, that one is liable for, if one has relations with his mother, he is liable for incest with his mother, but that's it, only that, and not for father's wife. If his mother happens to also be his father's wife, which it is usually, then it's imechahi, only for mother and not for father's wife. Ela me'ata ervat eshet abicha lo tegale, ervat abicha hi mishum eshet avata mechayebo, v'yata mechayebo mishum immo. If so, look at the next pasuk that says ervat eshet abicha. This is father's wife. One cannot reveal, meaning one cannot sleep with his father's wife. And it says, Ervat abichahi. And it's also extra words, right? That's revealing your father's nakedness, even though it's for his wife, but that's an affront to the father to sleep with his wife. So here it says, Ervat abicha, extra words. And what would you learn from those extra words? Would you not learn that if in a case when someone sleeps with his father's wife, he is liable only to his father's wife, even if it happens to be his own mother? No, only one count. And so the same methodology you'd use for this pasuk, you just use for this pasuk. And if you did that, you'd come up with a very strange conclusion that if someone slept with his mother, who's also his father's wife, he wouldn't be liable to anything at all. Like as follows: Ela imoshi eshet aviv. If it's his mother who is also married to his father, a usual normal family case. If you look at this pasuk here, you say, oh, this is excluding father's wife. And you look at this pasuk, this is excluding the prohibition against mother. In other words, each pasuk says, oh, this is only this prohibition, not the other one. And this is only this prohibition, not the other one. So each one cancels out the other prohibition. So then what do you have as a result? If someone sleeps with his mother who's not married to his father, then he would be liable. Let's say they were never married. He was born out of wedlock. So then he'd be liable because that's imo. Eshet aviv she'ena imo mechayav. If someone slept with his stepmother who's not his mother, right, which can happen, that also would be liable. In other words, you have only one or the other, then the prohibition would apply. But imo shehi eshet aviv la michayev kelal. But if it happens to be a normal family where it's his mother who is married to his father, then you would not be liable at all, because according to this logic of Abaye, each pasuk says only this and not the other one. Another pasuk says not the other prohibition. You end up with no prohibition. That would be crazy. And furthermore, what are the rabbis going to do? The Tanakama against the Yehuda, they have to deal with this extra word imechahi. So what are they going to deal with? What are they going to do with this word? Well, they do something with that word that we're going to see on the next stuff. We're not going to learn it now because we're going to learn it tomorrow. That this word imechahi is used for what Rav Shisha, the son of Ravidi, teaches, and that's what Rabbanan are going to use it for. So the Yehuda will also use it for that Rasha that we will see. Ela amar Rav Acha bered Rav Ika amar kera ervata mishum ervachat atamechayevo ve'i atamechayevo mishum shete ervot. So now we're going to have a new answer to the source for the Yehuda. Why does the Yehuda say that you're only liable to one count? If someone sleeps with his mother who is married to his father, still only one count of prohibition against mother, and the father's wife does not apply, because the pasuk says here, ervata, singular, right? Lo tegala ervata. That's only one. That means one prohibition. So we learn from there that one because of one violation of forbidden relations, one is liable, and not two. Ela me'ata ervat kalatecha lo tegala eshet bincha lo tegala ervata. Now we challenge this answer of Rav Acha, the son of Rav Ika, according to your methodology, the pasuk that says one cannot sleep with his daughter-in-law because that's the wife of your son. So lo tegal edvata, says edvata in singular. So if you apply the same methodology, then you'll say here also you can be liable to one count, but you cannot be liable to two counts if he sleeps with his daughter-in-law, even though she's also married. It's also adultery. But nobody agrees with that conclusion. V'atanan, in our Mishnah we learned, Habal kalato chayav aleha mishum kalato, mishum eshet ish, ben bechaye beno, ben nachar ben mitat beno, ve'la palig Rabbi Yehuda. In our Mishnah it says that someone who sleeps with his daughter-in-law is liable for incest of daughter-in-law and also for adultery, whether the son is alive or not. We saw if the son's not alive, actually, then the adultery would fall away. But if he's alive, then is liable to two counts. And Rabbi Yehuda agrees with this. So everybody agrees. So therefore, if you use this methodology here of edvata, then you're going to have to use it again here, and you're going to lead to a conclusion that nobody agrees with. So let's try to fix this up. Ela kevan dechad gufahu afagav de today's tureninu keti. Oh, so maybe we'll try to fix this answer by explaining that since the daughter-in-law is one person, she's one body, even though it is two prohibitions, and everybody agrees that both prohibitions of daughter-in-law and adultery would apply, it still says the singular edvata because it's describing one person, the daughter-in-law. That's why it says edvata there in singular, even though there's two prohibitions that apply. But that answer doesn't work because the same is true for our case. You can argue the same thing, that for someone's mother is one person, she has one body, and even though there's two prohibitions that apply, mother and father's wife, still it says edvata in singular because it's one body. And therefore, this derivation for the Yehuda that it says edvata in singular is not helpful, because if you follow that, it's going to apply to daughter-in-law, and nobody agrees in that case. Ela amar Rava kasava Rabbi Yehuda ervat abicha zo eshet abicha umay tila begezera shava. So rather we have a final answer according to Rava. He's going to be similar to Abaye, but he's going to make a key difference that will solve the problem that we had against Abaye. So Rava says, according to the Yehuda, the word ervat abicha, that word itself is referring to Eshet Avicha. And we learned that from a Gezerah Shava, from a pasuk in Vayikra 20:11. So he's talking about this pasuk. Remember, we were comparing 7 and 8 before. Abaye said that this pasuk that says Imecha means, in this relationship, you only have one prohibition of Imecha and not father's wife. And then he said Ervat Avicha means only one prohibition of Ervat Avicha and not Imecha. And in that case, what fell through the middle is a case of a regular family where the mother is also the father's wife, and then this pasuk excluded that one and that one excluded this one. So we have to solve that problem. So Rava says the following: the word Ervat Avicha, that itself is referring to the father's wife. And we know that from this pasuk here that says in Vayikra 20:11, Ervat Aviv Gila. So father's wife, that's called Ervat Aviv. So make a Gezerah Shava. This refers to this Ervat Aviv refers to a father's wife, and that applies in all cases. That mashma ben eshet aviv shehi imo ben eshet aviv she'ina imo, and this refers both to a father's wife that is his mother and a father's wife that's not his mother. This is referring to both cases. It's not excluding anything. So this word Ervat Avicha, as opposed to above that said, this means you only violate one prohibition of father's wife and not imo. Rava saying no, that's not what it means. Ervat Aviv means your father's wife, no matter what, whether that's also his mother or not his mother. Okay, so now we have those two cases. Imo she'ena eshet aviv minayin, what fits his mother, but not his father's wife. How do we know that he would violate that prohibition? Tamod lomad alvat imecha lo tegale imecha hi mishum imo ata mechayevo v'yata mechayevo mishum eshet aviv. So we know that from the first pasuk here, imecha hi alvat avicha v'alvat imecha. So that would be a prohibition of incest with one's mother. And the word imecha hi, which is extra words, that comes to tell me that if one has relations with his mother, then he only violates that one prohibition of mother and not father's wife. even if it is his mother who's his father's wife. In other words, that will cover the normal case of a full family that's would be two prohibitions. In Mecha, he says, no, it's only one prohibition. So this is the source for the Biyudah that says you're not going to violate two prohibitions. But we covered the problem of the missing middle, because no longer are we saying that Ervat Avicha is excluding the prohibition of Imecha, and because if you say that, then in the case of someone who's both his father and both his mother and his father's wife, then this pasuk excludes that pasuk, and that pasuk excludes this pasuk, and then there's no prohibition. So we're changing that by saying the extra words Ervat Avicha is actually not extra words. That's just a gezerah to say Ervat Avicha means father's wife, and that's going to apply in all cases, whether it's his mother or not. And so that will be one prohibition. If it happens to be his mother and his father's wife, Mechahi comes to say that will only be one prohibition. So therefore, in all three possible cases, there is one prohibition. If it's his mother and not his father's wife, then that's Ervat Imecha. If it's his father's wife who's not his mother, no problem, Ervat Abicha. And if it's both, well then this pasuk will apply, but Imecha will come and say, no, but we only apply one of them, and so that cancels this pasuk, and we have Imechahi, and he's left with one prohibition. And that's the source for the Biyudah, where there's just one prohibition, no matter what the case. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.